Okay, so in our last video, we talked about two things. First is the literary differences between romances and novels. And second is the cultural differences between romances and novels. By this, I mean that romances and novels serve different cultural functions. Romances, as we discussed, tend to shore up social ideals. So that is social rules and social idealizations of how class, gender, and family should work. In particular, one of the things that we discussed is that romances tend to align together social class and social morality. So aristocrats are not only social and state heads, but they are also moral and intellectual keepers. That is, that they seem to have a greater sense of morality than people that exist lower down the totem pole. By the time we get to the novel, particularly the late 18th century novel, we find that occasionally that idea may be shorn up, but what we're also seeing in the novel is that the novel pushes against, it questions, and in some cases, it even rejects long held social ideals, in particular, that alignment between aristocracy and morality. So, today, what I'd like to do is examine how Haywood and Burney represent character. And in so doing, I want us to think about how Haywood and Burney interact with and question mainstream ideas about how the world is supposed to work. To do this, I want to give you a little bit of cultural background on Burney and Haywood's world, and then I want to talk about Burney and Haywood themselves. So, first of all, the 18th century is really quite different in many ways from our own century. People have just a very different worldview. This worldview is guided by a strong sense of social hierarchy. And it's this sense of social hierarchy that actually begins to fray under economic, political, and just cultural pressures throughout the century. But this is what this hierarchy generally involves. The 18th century has a worldview in which there's a kind of social ladder, and people that exist lower down the social ladder are answerable to the people that exist higher on the social ladder. So this social ladder starts with God as its head. The next person down is the king and members of the aristocracy. So the king is not answerable to anyone else, but he is answerable to God. Next down the list is the male head of household. So that might be a husband and or a father. That person is answerable to the king and to the laws of the land and to God, but not to the female members of his household, nor to his own children, nor to his servants. Next member down this hierarchy is the female head of household, so the mother and or the wife, whose job it is in part to obey her husband as well as follow governmental laws as well as follow religious laws. That female head of household does have authority over some people, and those are children and servants, who are the last members on this social ladder. This is a kind of broad view about authority in the 18th century. In truth, when we think about things like nation, gender, age, and class, there are actually numerous subcategories. I'm going to look at two of them. They are gender and class. So 18th century has strong ideas about gender. Essentially, women are subservient to men. And in terms of class, what you have is this incredibly stratified and complex class system. It's far more complex than what we have, but these ideas are going to come into play in the works that we're reading this week. So in terms of the class ladder, at the very top, you have aristocrats. Aristocrats are people that have a long-standing family history. They have an inherited title. Typically, that title has been passed down for like centuries and conferred upon the family by a head of state. And aristocrats also tend to have vast amounts of wealth in the form of land. Next on the list are landed gentry. Landed gentry also have family histories, but they're not as long as aristocrats. They also have titles, but they're not as high as or socially high as those of aristocrats. And they may have been conferred more recently. And finally, landed gentry members do have land. They don't have as much as aristocrats. Now, aristocrats and landed members of the gentry Both are defined by the fact that by both their long-standing family history and the fact that they don't have to work. Because they both own land, they actually collect rent from farmers and other landholders, and that's what enables them to essentially live lives of leisure. So, next down the social totem pole are wealthy, non titled people. We might today think of them as sort of upper middle class. These are people that have to work for a living, but they typically have either high prestige jobs or they have jobs that net them a lot of money or both. So, it's people like merchants, bankers, lawyers, and doctors. Next on the totem pole is what we might consider middle class people. That is, people that have to work for a living. They do have good, steady jobs, but those jobs may not bring them as much money as people who are really wealthy. So it might be people like tradesmen, grocers, clergy, or teachers. Further down the list is domestic servants, so people that spend their lives in servitude to others, usually people higher up the totem pole. And then at the very bottom of the list are poor people, so people that work day jobs or people that are on aid. Now, there is some movement between these classes, but you don't have the same kinds of huge leaps in terms of class that you might see today. People typically can rise in terms of their class by marrying into a higher class or essentially buying into a higher class. And this is important to remember because it kind of changes the stakes on how people choose marriage partners in the 18th century. Basically, one's class position determines, I'd say, sort of how easy one's life is. And people are very eager to secure their social status or improve their social status. And while one way of doing that is through earning money, another way is through marriage. So, for this reason, in the 18th century, there are two tensions taking place in terms of marriage. There's a rise in the idea of what's called companionate marriage, or a marriage between two people based on a love match. But there's also varying degrees of arranged marriages. So, for example, if you were a member of an aristocratic family, you might be marrying someone through an arranged marriage whom you've never met, or you've only met once or twice. If you go lower down the ladder, you may find more marriages based on romance, but even at that, people are oftentimes marrying to secure their own interest. So they're marrying people to whom they've been introduced, but they've also vetted their bank book and also looked at what they're bringing to the marriage in terms of business connections, family connections, social connections, and money. So, for example, a member of the middle class, let's say a very successful grocer, might encourage his daughter to marry someone from a wealthier family, or a wealthy or a wealthy non-titled family, like a lawyer, might have amassed so much wealth that he tries to marry his son to someone whose daughter is a member of the landed gentry. So, um, essentially, what you see taking place in the 18th century is some movement in terms of class. That movement grows and grows as the 18th century continues. And in part, there is greater movement that we see in the 18th century between classes by the rise of new social spaces in the 18th century. So, in prior generations, like in the 11th century, the 12th century, you might find that people are really stratified in terms of where they can go and in terms of who they can interact with. In the 18th century, there is this rise of social spaces where people of different classes and different genders can meet up. So, let's take a look at some of those spaces. First, there's always been church. People of different classes and different genders have always met in church. In the 18th century, there's some other spaces as well. There are theaters, there's opera, there's coffee shops, there's just general shops. People that are wealthy can, rub shoulders with people that are aristocrats in shops in new resort towns or even in London in different shopping areas. Because they're all wearing similar clothing. This is a big change in the 18th century versus earlier centuries, where there actually were what we call sumptuary laws, where people of different classes could only wear certain types of clothing. In addition, newer spaces in the 18th century include the rise of these pleasure gardens, which are kind of like high-end adult amusement parks. They include things like Vauxhall, Ronley, and Marylebone Gardens. There's also public assemblies or public balls, and finally public parks that have just gotten built. Now, these spaces, combined with the fact that there is increased globalization, so there are increased abilities for people to make money and then rise up in terms of classes, puts pressure on long-held ideas about the alignment between class and personal self-worth. And it actually results in a lot of anxiety about how different classes behave and also about how women behave. And that's the other thing to remember that guides these two books is that these are two stories about women that exist in extremely patriarchal classes in which there are a lot of rules that govern how women behave, but not that many that govern how men behave. So I've listed some different rules that women follow in the 18th century, that they should follow in the 18th century to be respectable and successful. Essentially, it's important to remember that women in the 18th century are expected to be moral, that is, to have a strong sense of morality, but also to behave in ways that signal to the world that they are moral. So there's this idea that women in the 18th century need to protect their reputation, both by behaving in correct ways and by protecting themselves from gossip. So because of that, it changes how women are allowed or encouraged to behave. Here's some big things that can impact how women get treated and also the kinds of opportunities that are available for women to have lives of stability, safety, and possibly happiness. First of all, to be successful in the 18th century as a woman, you have to come from a respectable family. You have to live with your parents or with a family member before marriage and your husband after marriage. There's no becoming roommates with a good friend or living together before marriage. Your marriage has to be recognized in a public ceremony. There's no premarital sex. There's no extramarital sex. There's no premarital flirtation. That means that unmarried women cannot appear alone with a suitor or with a gentleman of suitable age to them unless that person is a family member or an approved, an approved suitor. Women are not allowed to talk to men unless they're formally introduced to them. They're not allowed to receive letters from men unless their family has granted permission. Young unmarried women are not allowed to declare their feelings for a man until he declares it to her. And she shouldn't behave in any ways that draw attention to herself. So she shouldn't be seen talking with men that she doesn't know. She shouldn't be seen laughing loudly. She shouldn't be seen wandering around. She shouldn't be seen talking loudly or saying things that seem a little bit unseemly. And she shouldn't be wearing loud or unchaste clothing. Now, the rules for men are a lot looser. Basically, young men, they're actually encouraged or at least allowed to have relationships with women prior to marriage and even during marriage as well. And so men actually oftentimes, particularly wealthy men, tend to have affairs with women who are lower down on the social ladder than they are. So in the 18th century, wealthy men basically prey on serving women who don't have family members to whom they are obviously answerable, or who have family members that maybe don't have a lot of social status, or women who behave in ways that would suggest that they are open to a relationship. And that can be women that do everything from talking loudly to wearing unseemly clothing to saying unseemly things. So because of this difference, you have the rise in 18th century literature of different stereotypes or different character types. And we see these a lot. We're going to see them in both Haywood and also Burney. Here's a couple of types that we see. Typically, 18th century literature has some type of a damsel in distress. That damsel typically has to be upper class or has to somehow signal that she has a strong moral sense that entitles her to protection. There are also low-class women in 18th century literature. Those are usually actresses, whores, servants, or women that are called cits. That is, women who come from families who are citizens of London that are tradesmen. And then on the male side, you have libertines. Libertines are men that enjoy having numerous relationships with women, usually sexual relationships. There's also typically a hero, which is a man that is going to try and protect the damsel in distress. There's also cits, so tradesmen who exist in London, and then villains. And we know that there's these types because, in part, Haywood actually helps to sort of develop these stereotypes that we see. So let's turn some attention to talking to Eliza Haywood. Eliza Haywood, we think, was born in 1693. She lived until 1756, and she was a prolific writer. She published over 60 works in her own lifetime, including novels, scandal chronicles, which are like gossip columns, plays, romances, and tales. Her career spans almost 35 years, and we can actually see shifts taking place within all of her works. From the early part of the 18th century, where she is establishing different stereotypes, to the latter part of the 18th century. So Fantomina, which is a relatively early work of hers, is written in this very as a kind of scandalous, very sort of racy romance. Her later works actually seem a little bit more like Evelina. That is, that they're more chaste, and they tend to look at romances, but tend to look at them from a kind of moralistic standpoint. And as I mentioned, her writing helps to establish these distinguishing characters and tropes that we associate eventually with the rise of the 18th century novel. Now, after Haywood is Frances Burney. She was born in 1752. She lived until 1840. And she didn't produce as many works as Haywood, nor did she write in as many genres. She produced four novels, as well as journals and letters and a memoir of her father. But she was incredibly famous and well-loved, and she influenced the works of writers well into the 19th century, writers like Jane Austen. Evelina is her first novel, and I would say, personally, I think it's her best, but also her most celebrated. It was published in 1778. Now, we're reading pieces of Evelina. It's actually like a 300-page novel. So here's a bit of background to help you get started. Evelina is the story of a young woman named Evelina, who's an orphan being raised by a clergyman named Mr. Villars, who functions for all intents and purposes, as her father. Now, he sends her to London with a friend of the family, and the story details her adventures coming into London as a very intelligent but very naive young woman. In particular, this story tracks the development of her relationship with two men. One is Lord Orville, and the other one is Sir Clement Willoughby. And Lord Orville actually eventually becomes her love interest. Sir Clement Willoughby is pursuing her. So Evelina, it's important to note, is born into tragic circumstances that impact her ability to function within London society, and in particular, the way in which men will relate to her. Evelina is very well born by birth. Her father is a member of the landed gentry. His name is Sir John Belmont. Her father seduced her mother into a private marriage, that is, a marriage that's not recognized by the state. He then gets angry with her and refuses to recognize their marriage, and essentially disowns Evelina as an infant. Her mother ends up dying of a broken heart, leaving the very young infant Evelina in the care of Mr. Villars, who is her mentor and her guardian. So Evelina has the manners and the morals and the education, the upbringing of someone who is very well born. And she actually is very well born. However, she doesn't have the money or the family connections to be recognized by society as well born. So in society's eyes, she's a penniless orphan and a bastard at best. So as you read these two works, in particular Evelina, I want you to think about how the characters either record or allow the author to represent anxieties about changes in class or changes in women's behavior. All right, I look forward to discussing the works with you on the discussion board.